Hi everyone, this is my Tales of the Dead, part 3. And this one is very personal. This has to do with the deaths of my parents. When my father was dying, he did not want to die in a hospital. And so he was in hospice care in his home. My mom took unbelievable care of him. I mean, I was so proud of her. But the truth is, there was a lot of suffering and a lot of pain leading up to his death. And for a while, he was in what I can only think of would be like a medically induced sleep. They had him on so many sedatives and everything to try, and at this point it was just a quality of life thing, to try and keep him out of pain as much as possible. The night my father died, all that day, I was obsessed with the idea that I had to go visit them that night. No matter what, I had to go visit them that night. And so when Jim got home, we did that. We went over there. And as usual, I walked in the front door and went straight to my father's room, and I held his hand and I gave him a kiss and I told him I was there. And then I went out into the living room to speak to my mom while Jim stayed in the room with my dad and the hospice worker who was there at the time. After a while, Mom and I were just talking, trying to be as normal, I guess, as we could be. And she asked me to look up something on the computer. And I can't remember what it was. But I was at the computer. And all of a sudden I felt this presence come into the room and come behind me. And just the slightest touch to my hair, and I smelled roses. Even though my dad's favorite flowers were daisies, roses were always associated with him because he grew them and everything. And sitting at the computer, I knew that my father had died in the next room. And my mother must have felt something too, because she suddenly said, "Let's go in and see Dad." And I didn't want to, because I knew that he was gone and I didn't know what was going to happen then. So I followed her into Dad's room, and she took one look at him and said, "He's gone. He's gone. My husband is gone." So I got her out of that room and back into the living room. I called Annie, her caretaker, and said, "It's time." His caretaker too. I said, "It's time. You need to come over here." And I hung up the phone, and I think I had to go to the bathroom, but I think I had to go to the bathroom to cry it out so that I wouldn't be crying in front of my mom. And when I came back in, she had called 911. And, the police and the ambulance and everything was on their way. At that point, I took my mother downstairs. Probably the first time in years she had been in the basement. And I took her to the one room in the basement that wasn't a hideous disaster. And we talked. And we talked of nothing. But the point was to keep her talking and to keep her focused on whatever chit-chat we were spewing and not what was going on upstairs. Because she made it a point that she did not want to see her husband taken out of the house. So we kept listening. It took forever. Even though he had a DNR, they still, took forever. But finally, when they left, I heard them leave, and Mom and I went back upstairs, and I asked her if she wanted me to spend the night, to stay there. And she said no. She was remarkably held together. And I asked again. I said, "Are you sure?" And she said, "Yes. I'm just so glad that you were here tonight. But I'd like to be alone." And I didn't want to leave, but when she told you she wanted to be left alone, then you left her alone. That was it. So my father let me know that he was going. Years later, sorry, on October 31st of this year would be the day that my mother passed away. And we knew it was inevitable because of her organs beginning to fail and everything. But, you still hold out that hope for a miracle. Well, that day, I was in my own hospital bed, being given IV fluids and having to drink nasty barium crap so that they could do scans and all this other stuff. And I remarked to Jim, when I was laying there preparing for the scans, this is how the family's always worked. Here I am in a hospital bed 2 hours away from my mother in a hospital bed in which she is dying. And as they wheeled me out of the triage room to get scans, I sat up. I just sat up. And Jim said, "What?" And I said, "She's gone. She's gone." And he knew what I meant. And it was different. She didn't come and say goodbye like Dad did, but it was just, I suddenly felt the absence of her energy. That's the only way I can describe it. And I knew she was gone. And when we got home, and I saw that fucking blinking light on the answering machine, I knew what it meant. So I called the ICU. And the poor guy I got apparently had thought somebody else would have already told me and was just kind of stammering on the phone when I was asking about my mother. And so, poor guy, I just said, "My mother's dead, isn't she?" And he said, "I'm sorry, but yes, she is." I said, "Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking care of her." And thank you. And I hung up. I couldn't call my brother. I couldn't call my grandmother. I couldn't say those words to them. And I thank God for my husband because he did all of that for me. A few days after my mother died, I was outside and I said, offhandedly, "Mom, I'd like to believe that you're with Dad right now and you don't remember the pain and all the bad things and stuff. And I know I'm not supposed to ask for signs and things like that, but if you could just put a feather of a specific type in my path to let me know that you're okay, I'd really like that." And an hour later, I was walking the dogs outside and there was the feather of a specific type right where I was walking. I just looked down and there it was. And so I figured, why not ask Dad for a different kind of feather? And I did. And I got one. And I've received a feather in my path almost every day since. So while this isn't necessarily about a ghost story, It's more about the different ways a loved one says goodbye. When they transition, most people say when they die, but I prefer the word transition because they're not dead, they're not gone, they're not erased. They still live, just not here. But don't worry, no more of my tales of the dead will be this personal and this weepy. But I had to share this one. Thanks for listening. And those feathers I've asked for, I've saved them. As is part of my personality, I turn them into a fetish. And every time I find a feather, I add to it. And let me share it with you. Picture of my parents on their wedding day. And these are all the feathers that I have so far received. It won't focus, but it says promise. I found that on the ground as well.